Alright, so we are on the other side of the Caro Kann this game. I've been recently experimenting with the accelerated Panov, but going for pawn to e5. I think it's like the Toikinen gambit, and we actually faced that in a previous episode from the black side, which I'd encourage you to watch if you're interested. Um, but I think that the Panov is definitely the line that I'm preferring right now and having the best results with. And it's 100% my recommendation against the Caro Kann defense. The interesting thing is as well, like, I don't have any kind of opening course, as in, I haven't watched or studied an opening course or book or anything on the Panov Attack. I've literally just found it very intuitive to play, and obviously I've learned through my own analysis of my own games. Like, for example, here, the most common move and the computer's favorite move is knight to f3. But after bishop g4, it can lead to some very drawish lines, which it can lead to a forced endgame, essentially, which, if I remember, I will show you after the game. But personally, for that reason, and also to avoid all the theory that comes along with that, I like the move bishop to g5, which is an odd-looking move because you may be thinking, well, Alex, you're not actually pinning the knight to the queen. Is your bishop not vulnerable to, I don't know, a move like h6, for example? Kind of, kind of. What I play with the black side here is not pawn to e6. If I remember correctly, I play bishop to e6, which looks like a very strange move, but it's actually very good. I believe it's bishop e6. I don't think you play pawn to g6 just yet, but the idea is to play g6, bishop g7, and that's what I personally play with the black pieces. And it's very interesting when you face an opening that you play yourself. So, like, I play this with black, and facing it with the white pieces, it's very, very interesting to see how different people play the positions. So my opponent plays e6, which personally I find to be very passive for the black side, but that's just my opinion. Here we can continue with knight to f3. We can also play pawn c5, followed by bishop to b5 ideas, which are very nice. But I think we can start with knight to f3. I don't think it makes that big a difference. I don't think my opponent is going to take. And now, after bishop e7, I'm going to play pawn to c5, which the engine may not love, but this bishop to b5 move I find very powerful. Very powerful. And it doesn't look that... It looks strange. It does look strange because, you know, I'm not pinning this knight to anything. I'm not even really threatening to take the knight, per se. Like, if I take the knight, I don't gain anything necessarily. But one of the big ideas that you need to be aware of in the Panov Attack as we continue to castle is that the main pawn break for black, well, there's two main pawn breaks. There's pawn to b6, which is not so concerning in most lines, and there's pawn to e5. And when provoked with pawn a6, we're just going to take on c6, which looks ludicrous. Like, why am I trading off my light squared bishop, which theoretically should be my good bishop, because my pawns in the center are on dark squares? My light squared bishop on a square like d3, for example, should be very powerful. And that's true. It can be very powerful. But the Panov is strange. It's a strange opening. And as I said, b6 is one of the ideas for black to break. Although we get a 3-on-2 on the queen side, right? So we can kind of, with a move like b4, let's say take, we get a passed pawn on c5, which is also protected. But the other pawn break is pawn to e5. So by taking this knight on c6, we've removed one of black's pieces that can control the e5 square. And we can proceed to whack a knight on e5 ourselves, applying pressure to the bishop, which, although we've given black the bishop pair, the position is closed. b6 isn't playable because you hang your bishop. And of course, e5 is never really going to happen. There are some tactical ideas with e5 in the future where you can overload the d pawn and win the c pawn, for example, but it's very difficult to make that happen, right? So with it being more of a closed position, it can actually favor us having the 2 knights compared to black's 1 knight, which is it's fascinating, in my opinion, this opening as a whole. We need to be aware that black could try to open the position a bit with knight to e4 ideas in the future. And let's say, you know, knight e4, I don't know, knight e4. We can get some interesting positions after, like, d takes e4, trying to expose potential weakness on the d4 with our pawn on d4. And those positions are very interesting. And black has fighting chances here, absolutely. Although the position looks odd and very constricted for the black side, black can try and break out with these moves like knight to e4, pawn to b6, pawn e5 if possible. So we do need to be careful here. We do need to be careful. The first move I'm considering is pawn b4. Just taking space on the queen side, maybe preparing pawn a4, pawn b5 to harass the bishop and kick it back to d7 or e8, and open up the a file for our rook to come to like a7 and get a step closer to creating a passed pawn. That's all well and good, but it will take a bit of time to execute that idea. If pawn to b4, what do we do after knight to e4? Well, if my opponent takes on g5, then knight to d6 looks very strong, with tempo on the rook, pawn f4 on the way maybe. Our knights look very powerful there. So if pawn to b4, knight to e4, knight takes, and pawn takes, leaving the bishop trade open and stopping knight d6, we could trade bishops and leave it as bishop versus knight and continue with pawn to a4. Although our d4 pawn would be weak, we do have very interesting play there. We could play this very strange move, pawn to f3, though, which the more I'm looking at it, the more I'm kind of liking. Just stopping the knight from coming into e4 forever, which makes it difficult to facilitate a trade of the bishops as well. So if pawn to f3 and black goes for a move like knight to d7, theoretically we could go bishop to f4, avoiding a bishop trade, or we could play something like take. We could take the bishop, we could take the knight, we could play rook to e1 supporting the knight. f6 would always leave e6 weak. I'm going to go pawn f3. A very odd move, and I don't know if it's the right move. I'm not going to pretend to know everything, of course. I'm a decent chess player, but like, these are difficult positions to navigate for, like, well, players of my caliber, I suppose. Oh, pawn to b5. That's a very committal move. First thing you should notice is it weakens this bishop. That's the first thing I notice. It's now only defended by the rook rather than the pawn as well. Although we have no good way of dislodging the rook for the time being. We probably shouldn't allow pawn to b4. Oh, no, wait. If pawn b4, we can go knight to a4. Maybe my opponent didn't like the idea of something like take and knight to a4 trying to come into b6. But I thought that black could always play knight to d7 to stop that. Well, if we go rook e1, pawn b4, knight a4, trying to come into b6, he probably wants to take, and then his pawns are super weak, and the c pawn is very nice. So rook e1 looks fine to me. I don't like the look of pawn b5 for black at all. I really don't like it. And in the long run, we can play something like b4, a4 to try and break through on the queen side. I'm, very skeptical. Very, very skeptical of that move. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. But our opponent is ahead of us is ahead of us in terms of time. Okay, knight d7. Offering a bishop trade and a knight trade. Okay, how do we want to handle this? Well, we could accept the bishop trade, which seems viable. We could bring our bishop back to f4, declining the bishop trade. I would expect a move like bishop to f6, trying to insist on trades. Pawn b4. The question is, do we want to keep more pieces on the board? Alternatively, we could take the light squared bishop, but I think that would be a big mistake. Because if something like take, let's say bishop to f4, this bishop can't influence the e5 square, right? It seems to defeat the purpose of trading our bishop on c6 earlier in the game if we're then going to trade off our knight for his light squared bishop, if you get what I mean, because this bishop can't influence e5. Our knight can. So this seems like a terrible move to me. We could take on d7. I'm not sure what we're gaining there. Something like take b4. Maybe that's the easiest thing to do. Bishop f4. If f6, then e6 is very weak. Bishop f6, pawn b4. It's probably the same scenario. Although if bishop f4, take, bishop f6, b4, same scenario. We're going to play a4, and there's very little black can do about it, because we have so much support for that. And if you go b4, I can go knight to a4. So, okay. Maybe it doesn't really matter how we respond, so long as we don't take this bishop. Maybe it doesn't really matter. If bishop f4, he could play bishop g5. Maybe that's a difference. If we take, he also has queen g5 as a possibility. I'm going to go bishop to f4. I'm going to go bishop f4. I think it's interesting because if bishop to g5, we don't actually have to trade the bishops. We could drop the bishop back to g3. He could go bishop h4 there. Knight to b8. That is a gross move. Played very quickly as well. I don't really get that. Pawn b4, pawn a4. How is black stopping us? Pawn f6, obviously I'm not going to take. I'm just going to drop back to d3. Bishop e8. Okay, so he wants to bring the knight to c6, I assume. But that's a very long-winded plan to achieve what feels like not very much. I mean, just look aesthetically at the black position. It looks so cramped. Pawn a4. Knight c6. I'm just going to take. And a6 is going to be so weak once the a-file opens. I see no reason not to just strike now with pawn a4. f6. Okay, so he wants to kick my knight back and then play knight c6. Interesting. Not sure it's the best play, though. Because e6 is very weak. So after knight d3, our knight controls b4, c5, e5, all very important squares. By playing f6, black also blocks off possibilities of trading the bishops, which my bishop is very strong. Very, very strong. Stopping moves like rook b8 in the future. This looks completely dominant. This looks completely dominant. You know, if knight c6, d4 is under attack. We could defend it, but I think it's better just to start chopping. If knight c6, ab5, knight d4, we take on a6. Okay. Black tries to break out of the position with e5. And as I said earlier in the game, e5 can often be executed in an attempt to overload my d-pawn. But I've already played b4, so c5 is already well defended. It doesn't matter that my d-pawn is overloaded, because this looks completely lost for black. d5 looks weak. I'm just going to win a pawn now. And I'm not really sure where the counterplay is. If pawn d4, perhaps the idea is to dislodge my knight's defense of the a4 pawn, which is interesting. However, can I just take on f6? Because if you take, then I take with a deadly fork. Also, queen to b3 is interesting with check. And if you move the king, then I have the option of knight to d5. Although bishop f7, I do have pawn to e6, which is interesting. Queen b3, if bishop f7, then pawn e6. If take, 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 take. Oh, my knight is hanging, so I probably need to take on c3. It's interesting. It's interesting. Queen here, king h8. Knight d5, bishop f7, pawn e6. So if knight takes, my bishop hangs. If bishop takes, bishop f7, now there's no pawn e6. My knight is under attack. That's an interesting line. So perhaps it's easier just to take on f6, bishop takes, and play knight to e4. And if you take on a4, then I can play a move like knight d6, which looks very strong. Let's do that. My knight on d3 is an excellent piece. Keeping a hold of b4, keeping a hold of the bishop, providing further support to c5, although that's obviously well defended, and also blockading the d-pawn. Okay, bishop f6. So we are up a pawn. Fantastic. And knight to e4 looks quite nice. If queen b3, bishop f7, then we just, our queen's under attack, our knight's under attack. That's no good. So let's go knight to e4. This d4 pawn is a passed pawn. It's well protected. We have no good way of getting rid of it just yet. But our knight on d3 is a very good blockader. Knights make the best blockaders of pawns in general, because my knight can still perform all of its normal duties. It can see all of its normal squares because it can hop over pieces. So the fact that it's behind the pawn doesn't impede its function in any way. And it can always hop over the pawn and then come back to the defense if it needs to. Whereas, let's say a rook was on d3, it would be significantly hindered because of the pawn being in the way of its scope. So my opponent takes on a4, restores material equality. I thought knight d6 would be pretty killer here, though. Thought this would be pretty killer. Because the rook is running out of squares as well. Taking this bishop is viable, but, I'm not really going to win back the d-pawn anyway. I don't care that much about it because it's well blockaded. The open b file isn't too concerning either, because b4 is well protected by the knight. So we are hitting the rook and the bishop. Rook c6. Okay. So we could take, and win back the pawn, threatening something like taking the knight and then taking the rook. a6 is weak. The knight has no good moves. This looks crushing. If we take here, rook takes d6, comes with an attack on the queen. Rook e8. It's overly complicated. I don't see a reason to go into those complications. So what's wrong with just knight takes, rook takes, and queen a4? My knight is such a good piece. Such a good piece. Yeah, I'm going to go for that. It may look odd to be trading off my fantastic knight on d6, but I think, firstly, I win material immediately. And also there's so much pressure in the position. There's pressure on both rooks, pressure on the knight, pressure on a6. The black pieces seem to be stumbling over each other. Rook to e6 looks like a good move. Yeah, he does play it. Queen b3 looks slightly concerning for black to deal with, pinning the rook, threatening to win it. If queen d7, let's say, I can take the knight and overload this rook. Ooh, that's really strong. Queen b3. If king to f7, I can probably just play take, 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 and I'm up 2 pawns. Yeah, as I said, I didn't calculate out any of this. I didn't even see rook e6 in my initial calculation, but I didn't think it mattered because we just had way too much pressure in the position. We could take the rook first and then play queen b3. I don't know if that changes anything because I can take the rook whenever I want, so I don't think it's I don't think it makes a difference. So let's go queen b3. Quite a quiet move, just bringing the queen back, applying pressure. But it looks deadly. Queen d7. Yeah, no, this loses on the spot, doesn't it? Well, I could just take the rook, actually. And if rook takes, then I take. And if here, rook takes, and I take the knight, and my opponent sees that, and he resigns. There we go. There we go. 25 moves, completely winning position. That was a very nice game, a very comfortable game. And I've got to say, personally, those are the types of positions I really, really enjoy. The really fun position to play, in my opinion. You know, it's not loads of tactics flying everywhere, but it's sustained positional pressure, leading to a bit of a tactical flurry, in which we come out on top because my opponent lashes out with pawn e5 because his position is so cramped. And this is why I recommend the Panov against the Caro Kann. My opponent is clearly a good player, but couldn't deal with the Panov. Let's jump into the analysis and see what the computer has to say. Okay, so 88.8% accuracy for us, 78.8% for my opponent. Let's jump into it. So, what I will preface with is the fact that I've recently been toying with this line with pawn e5. The Toikkonen Gambit, I think that's how you pronounce it. And we faced this a few episodes ago on the speedrun, so you can check that out if you're interested. But there's some really interesting lines after like dc4, bishop c4, what was it? Something like queen d4, queen e2, bishop g4, pawn f3, bishop f5, and something like e6. These lines I found really interesting in the analysis of that video. Not what we went into, because I didn't want to face this with the black pieces, but very interesting nonetheless. However, we play a Panov Attack. So ed5, cd5, c4. And this is the Panov. And this, like I said, is an opening that I've been enjoying tremendously over the past few months without any actual opening knowledge or like theoretical knowledge in terms of like courses and whatnot or books. But I don't think it's necessary. I think the Panov, if you can understand the ideas of it, I don't think the move orders are that important. Now, one thing that is important though is that knight to f3 leads to a very strange position after bishop g4, cd5, knight d5, queen b3, bishop f3, what is it, gf3, and can I remember? I think it's like e6, queen b7, knight d4. Yeah, this is it. Bishop b5, knight b5, queen b5, queen d7, queen d7, king d7, knight d5, ed5. And that's obviously a very long string of moves, but this is all theory. And that's what black has the option to go into this if you play knight to f3 all the way back on move 6. Black can kind of force this line, and this is just dull, in my opinion. D5 is weak, sure, but I think this is very dull, and I don't think any of you really want to see it or play it for yourselves, because why would you? It's effectively a draw offer, in my personal opinion. So bishop g5 is the move that I like. My opponent goes e6. Bishop e6 is the move that I play here with the black pieces. Idea being that if you're going to put pressure on my knight that's defending d5, then I'll just defend d5 with the bishop instead. And if you want to take my knight, sure. I'll take back, open up the bishop, get ready to castle. All good with me. But e6 is played with the same idea of defending d5, but you're also blocking off your bishop. So we go knight to f3, bishop to e7, and c5, which is the best move. And now we want to try to build up pressure on the queen side in the long run, but we need to ensure that e5 cannot be played to undermine our d-pawn and therefore the c-pawn. So my opponent castles, we go bishop to b5, which is the best move. I used to play bishop d3, not realizing the power of the bishop on the b5 square, which also, by the way, stops the immediate b6, challenging the pawn, because we can just take the knight. One of the problematic lines here is pawn b6, and here bishop to b5 is the best move, but you've already put it here. And obviously you don't want to take, because, like, well, you just lost your c5 pawn, which was putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the black position. So bishop e5 stops b6, applies pressure to the knight. The best move here for black is knight to e4, which I was expecting. And after something like bishop e7, let's say queen e7, we can just take on c6 and be very happy. So the best move is to take with a knight. Retreating the knight feels odd. Something like rook c1, computer likes queen a5, queen a4. And, I mean, this is an interesting position in my opinion. Going into this, not an endgame, but like a late middle game, where I think white has good pressure, but it will be hard to convert this. The computer wants black to go for pawn to e5 as quickly as possible. But bishop d7 played by my opponent, a very natural looking move, supporting the knight. But the engine doesn't like it. I castle. The engine likes taking immediately, but my opponent goes a6, provoking me, and then of course I'm happy to take. I wouldn't be surprised if a6 is one of the most common moves in this position. I don't know if the explore thing will tell me. No. Let me just check Lichess quickly, because I'm curious. Okay, so in this position, according to the Lichess database, I don't know if you can see this properly. You can't really, but you'll have to take my word for it. 32% of the games play pawn to a6 with an average rating of 2064. There's lots of different moves that are played in this position, but a6 is the most common. So, you know, it is likely to happen. Second most common move is b6, which is surprising. Sorry, after castles, I mean, is actually b6. And here the engine likes take, knight to e5, putting pressure on the bishop. And let's say bishop to e8, b4. And I mean, just look at this pressure we have. It's so, so nice. But a6 played. We take on c6. Potentially a surprise to my opponent. He may have been expecting something like bishop to a4, which isn't as good, because we want to take on c6. Like, counterintuitively, considering our pawns are on dark squares, like, giving away the bishop pair, even though we don't have to. But it's all about this e5 square. So bishop takes. Knight e5. The engine prefers rook e1 or pawn to b4, but they're all similar. They're all similar. Pawn b4 is the better move, though. And after knight to e4, we play take... Wait, sorry, I thought we could do this. That was why I didn't play b4, because my knight was no longer defended. The engine wants queen c2, queen e7, queen c3. Oh, yeah, okay. So this bishop versus knight is very good for us because of how weak e5 is. And if f6 is played, stopping us from going e5, we can just turn our attention to the queen side for a start, but also e6 is weak. Yeah, that's very interesting. So, I went knight e5 though. Rook to c8, f3. Engine doesn't like f3. It wants b4. I was concerned about knight e4. The engine again wants this line with queen c2, queen e7, and queen to c3. I didn't see that. I was considering bishop d8, knight d1, rook d1, rook d1. Sorry, rook d8 even. And this is still good for us, though. It is still good for us. But I went f3, thinking I was very smart. My opponent went b5. Huge mistake. Huge mistake. Which I kind of thought it was at the time. It's a terrible move. And I went rook e1, which is fine. b4 is also fine, but I just preferred rook e1. Knight d7. And here I went bishop f4, and that is a miss. That's a miss. Okay. The engine... There's two moves that it likes. One of them shocks me. So the one it really likes is bishop e7, queen e7, and yeah, knight c6. It wants to take on c6, which I find so surprising because of knight d5. Oh, that's the only reason. I completely missed that tactic. Completely missed that tactic. And yeah, we can go for the same thing here as well with the different move order. I completely missed that. That's why bishop f4 is a miss, but it's still, like, we still have a clear advantage. But yeah, I missed the fact that the queen on e7 was vulnerable. But okay. Okay. Knight b8. Again, a very strange move. b4 is the engine's preferred move. I thought I could play knight to a4 here. And the only move to try to hold on for black is queen to a5. Knight c6, rook c6, and pawn b3. I still think we have very nice sustained pressure here. I still really like this position for white. e5 can't be played. Our knight is a bit of a nuisance, threatening always to come to b6. Our bishop is so powerful, and I love this sort of position. But knight b8 from my opponent. We go b4, best move. Bishop to e8. And this idea of bringing the knight to c6 was interesting, but it felt too slow. Pawn a4. Pawn f6 is a big mistake. Better is ba4, knight a4, allowing this line. And then h6. And if the knight hops into b6... rook c7, aligning with the bishop, which obviously feels very strange. Although, you know, I don't have any tactics just yet, because I don't want to take on f7 and have, like, two pieces... Well, have a rook and a pawn for two pieces. That's a terrible trade, obviously. But pawn f6 from my opponent, knight to d3, and he's just creating his own problems. And he lashes out with e5, which I do understand. Now, the engine likes ab5, and I did consider this move briefly. I did see this idea of just sacrificing the piece for the two pawns and just throwing the pawns at my opponent. And it's interesting because, like, knight c6, let's say, knight f4, if knight to b4, pawn a7, let's say rook to a8, engine likes queen b3, and our pawns are just such a problem, and our pieces are so active. It's very nice. But I saw no need. I saw no need. I thought this was more simple. d4 is a mistake, but it is the most natural move, to be fair. The best move is knight c6. Just allowing a move like e6, which, you know, feels very odd. Or ab5, which, again, just feels odd. Wait. Oh, the engine finds knight to b4, and if we take, then bishop c5. That's interesting. But pawn d4. I take on f6, which is good. Bishop f6, knight e4, and my knight is just such a nice piece. b takes a4, knight d6. Engine prefers bishop to d6, and after rook f7. Knight f6, let's say queen f6, knight e5, let's say rook a7, queen d4, and I guess we're just suffocating the black position. Let's say knight c6. Ah, queen d5. Okay, what about knight d7? Bishop e7. Sorry, bishop e7? That's nuts. That's nuts. But knight d6 felt very nice to me. And more simple than what the engine is suggesting. That's just my opinion. Rook c6, obviously the most natural move, right? Not losing the exchange. And here we have a nice little tactical idea of knight e8, rook e8, and queen a4. Here, black's best option is to take on e1. and then bring the rook back to c8 and try to survive this position. Queen a2, king h8, bishop b8, rook b8, and queen a6. And my knight is so powerful. This is the main issue, and this is what I was talking about with the knight on d3. The knight controls our pawns perfectly while blockading the black pawn, which is limiting the effectiveness of his own bishop. If bishop g5 trying to infiltrate, we can play pawn f4, and our knight defends all our pawns, stops pawn d3 forever, and we're just up 2 clean pawns with a pair of connected passed pawns, and black's passed pawn is irrelevant because we have a stronghold on d3. So rook to e6 is the most natural move. Queen b3 and rook e6 are both completely winning. And here, I was expecting king to f7, although this is still completely losing after something like take, rook e1. And when you try to defend your rook, then I just take on b8, and if you take, then I take. So you're down a piece and a pawn, no matter what you do. My opponent plays queen d7 and resigns on the spot, because I will play something like rook e6, queen e6, queen e6, rook e6, bishop b8, and if you try to create counterplay, you just don't have enough. You have no other way to dislodge my knight, so your pawn will never get through, and this will be a relatively easy cleanup process. Up a piece and a pawn with a c pawn that is marching down the board very, very quickly. And yeah, 25 moves, very clean win. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you learned a lot also. If you want to see another very interesting game in the Panov Attack, which, by the way, as I said, I love the Panov. I love it. Check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in one of those videos.